April 22, 1944, 06 Ober hours, Union Pacific Railroad Station, Cheyenne, Wyoming. Unteroffizier Hans Weber stepped off the train into a dawn so crisp it seemed the air itself might shatter. The Wyoming sky stretched endless above, a vast blue canvas unbroken by clouds, the horizon jagged with distant mountains. Around him, 19 other German prisoners of war shuffled into a ragged line, their breath visible in the cold, their faces etched with fatigue from the long journey from a POW camp in Nebraska. They wore mismatched uniforms, patched and faded, the remnants of Wehrmacht pride now reduced to practical necessity. Hans adjusted his worn field cap, squinting against the low sun, trying to make sense of this place. It was nothing like the war-torn Europe he'd left behind. No bombed-out cities, no air raid sirens, just open land that seemed to go on forever, dotted with grazing cattle and barbed wire fences. The men whispered among themselves in German, voices low, uncertain. "What is this place?" one muttered. "They're sending us to work with cowboys, like in the films?" Another, a wiry private named Klaus, snorted softly. "Cowboys won't want us. They'll spit on us, or worse, we're the enemy." Hans stayed silent, his mind turning over the propaganda he'd been fed for years. Americans were brash, uncultured, driven by greed and individualism. Their society a chaotic mess of excess. Yet his 6 months in American captivity had already chipped away at those certainties. The food was plentiful, better than anything he'd eaten since 1941. The guards were firm but not cruel. Still, this was different. They were being sent to work on ranches, living among American civilians, far from the barbed wire and watchtowers of the camp. What would these people, these cowboys, make of German prisoners dropped into their world? A stocky American sergeant, his face tanned and creased from years under the sun, approached with a clipboard. His uniform was practical, his boots scuffed but polished, and he carried himself with the easy confidence of someone who'd never known defeat. He spoke in halting German, his accent thick but clear enough. "All right, you fellas, you're being assigned to ranches around Laramie County. You'll work 8 hours a day, 6 days a week. Ranch work, herding cattle, fixing fences, haying, whatever the rancher needs. You'll be supervised, but you do right, you'll be treated right. Step out of line and you're back in the camp, maybe with a few extra chores to keep you honest. Any questions?" No one spoke. The sergeant nodded, glanced at his clipboard and started calling out names and assignments. Weber, Klaus, Mueller, Bartee Ranch, 15 miles west. Tom and Ellie Dawson, cattle and some crops. A dusty pickup truck rolled up, its engine rumbling, its bed loaded with bales of hay and a toolbox that rattled with every bump. The driver was a man in his late 40s, lean and wiry, wearing a faded denim jacket, a Stetson hat tilted back on his head, and boots that looked like they'd walked 1,000 miles. Tom Dawson, Hans presumed. His face was weathered, his eyes sharp but not unkind, sizing up the 3 prisoners with a look that was neither welcoming nor hostile, just measuring. "Get in the back," he said in English, gesturing to the truck bed. Hans caught the meaning from the gesture, though his English was limited to a few phrases picked up in the camp. The prisoners climbed in, careful not to disturb the hay or tools, and the truck lurched forward, kicking up dust as it headed west. The drive took them through a landscape that felt like another planet to Hans. Endless plains stretched out, broken only by low hills and the occasional cluster of cottonwood trees along a creek. Cattle grazed in the distance, their shapes small against the vastness. No sign of war here, no craters, no shattered villages, just open land and a sky that seemed to mock the confines of the world. Hans had known the Bartee Ranch came into view after an hour. A sprawling spread of wooden buildings, corrals and barns, all surrounded by barbed wire fences. A modest house with a wide porch stood at the center, smoke curling from its chimney. A woman stepped out as the truck pulled up, her hair tied back, her apron practical but clean. Ellie Dawson, Hans guessed, her expression mirroring her husband's cautious, appraising but not cruel. Tom Dawson climbed out, exchanged a few words with his wife in rapid English. Hans couldn't follow, then turned to the prisoners. In broken German, he said, "Work hard, eat good, work bad, no good. Understand?" Hans nodded. "Ja, verstehen." Tom gestured toward a corral where a dozen cows stood, their breath steaming in the morning air. "Start with feeding, show you how." As they walked toward the corral, Ellie Dawson reappeared, carrying a tray with tin mugs. She handed one to each prisoner without a word. Coffee, black and strong, hot enough to warm their hands through the metal. Hans stared at the mug. his mind struggling to reconcile the gesture. They were German prisoners, enemies of these people, yet here was this woman, offering coffee as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Klaus whispered to Hans, "What's this? They poison us first?" Hans shook his head, taking a cautious sip. It was bitter but good, better than the watery ersatz coffee he'd known in Germany. "No poison," he muttered, "just coffee." Ellie noticed their hesitation and spoke slowly, her English clear enough for Hans to catch the gist. "Long day ahead, coffee helps, drink up." There was no warmth in her tone, but no malice either, just a practical statement, as if feeding coffee to German POWs was as routine as feeding the livestock. Hans drank, the warmth spreading through him, and felt the first stirrings of something he couldn't name. Relief, perhaps, or the beginnings of understanding that this place, these people, were not what he'd been taught to expect. The propaganda had painted Americans as reckless and selfish, but this simple act of offering coffee suggested something else. A people who valued getting the job done, even if it meant sharing a drink with the enemy. The system of ranch labor was born of necessity, not sentiment. By 1944, America's agricultural heartland faced a crisis. Young men who'd once worked the ranches and farms had been drafted into the military or lured to war factories in cities like Detroit and Chicago. Wyoming's ranches, vital for beef production to feed both civilians and soldiers, were desperately short of hands. Crops needed harvesting, cattle needed tending, fences needed mending, and the women, older men, and children left behind couldn't do it all alone. The solution was to use the labor of the 380,000 German and Italian POWs held in camps across the United States. The Geneva Conventions allowed for prisoner labor in agriculture, provided it was safe and fairly compensated. For the U.S. War Department, it was a practical fix. Keep the prisoners productive, ease the labor shortage, and ensure food security without pulling men back from the front. The Agricultural Extension Service, working with local ranchers and county agents, coordinated the assignments. Ranchers could request POW labor, and prisoners would be sent from camps to work under civilian supervision with minimal military oversight. The goal was efficiency, get the work done while maintaining security and adhering to international law. For Wyoming ranchers like the Dawsons, it meant accepting German prisoners onto their land, men who'd fought against American soldiers, some of whom might have killed neighbors' sons or brothers. It wasn't an easy sell. Many ranchers had lost family to the war. Others had endured years of anti-German propaganda. But practicality won out. Beef was critical to the war effort, and if German prisoners could keep the ranches running, then German prisoners would be put to work. It wasn't about forgiveness, it was about survival. Hans Weber's first week at the Bar T Ranch set the rhythm for what would follow. Work began at dawn, the prisoners billeted in a bunkhouse near the main house, a simple wooden structure with cots, a wood stove, and a small table for writing letters home, all subject to censorship. Ellie Dawson provided coffee and biscuits each morning, a ritual that never ceased to surprise Hans. The tasks varied: feeding cattle, repairing fences, cleaning barns, or hauling water from the creek. Tom Dawson was a patient teacher, showing Hans how to handle a lasso. Though Hans's first attempts were clumsy, the rope tangling around his feet to Tom's amused grunt. "Takes practice," Tom said in English, miming the motion again. Hans nodded, determined to get it right, not out of fear but because he sensed Tom respected effort. The work was demanding but not brutal. Herding cattle required learning to read the animals' movements, anticipating their shifts across the open range. Fixing fences meant wrestling with barbed wire, a task that left Hans's hands scratched and bleeding until he learned to handle it with care. Hay trick was backbreaking, the bales heavy under the Wyoming sun. But it was honest work, and Hans found himself appreciating the clarity of it. No ambiguity, no moral weight, just tasks that needed doing. Tom supervised with a light touch, explaining tasks clearly, correcting mistakes without shouting, and stepping in only when necessary. His German was limited to phrases like "do this" or "not like that," but he used gestures and demonstration to bridge the gap. By the end of the first week, Hans and the others had picked up enough English to understand basic instructions, and Tom had learned a few German words, creating a rough but functional pidgin. What struck Hans most was the absence of hatred. He'd braced for hostility, expecting the Dawsons to see him as the enemy, to treat him with the bare minimum required by regulations. Instead, they were businesslike, neither warm nor cruel, just focused on the work. Ellie brought coffee and biscuits for breaks, not as a gesture of friendship, but because, as she put it, can't work on an empty stomach. When Klaus cut his arm on a rusty nail, Ellie cleaned and bandaged it with the same matter-of-fact efficiency she'd use for anyone on the ranch. "Don't let it get infected," she said, handing him a clean cloth. Hans watched, marveling at the lack of resentment. These people had every reason to hate Germans. Tom's nephew was fighting in Italy, might even be facing Hans's old unit, yet they treated the prisoners as workers, not as symbols of the enemy. The local community's response was mixed but practical. Cheyenne and the surrounding ranches were tight-knit, bound by shared hardship and the demands of ranch life. Some locals resented the prisoners' presence. Old Man Hargrove, whose son had died at Pearl Harbor, would glare at Hans and the others whenever they passed through town on their way to the general store with Tom. "Krauts," he'd mutter, loud enough to be heard. Others, like the store clerk Miss Thompson, were more pragmatic. "They're here, they're working, and we need the help," she'd say, ringing up supplies for the ranch. No sense making a fuss. The local diner refused to serve prisoners, but since the prisoners weren't there to eat, the rule was more symbolic than practical. Over time, the community's wariness softened, not out of affection, but because the Germans proved reliable, doing the work without causing trouble. The church was a different story. Reverend Lyle, a young pastor with a gentle voice and a limp from a childhood accident, made it clear that the prisoners were welcome at Sunday services. "God's house doesn't care what flag you fought under," he said at a town meeting. When someone questioned the idea, "They're men, far from home, and they're welcome to pray with us." Hans attended one Sunday, curious but cautious, sitting in the back with Klaus and Mueller. The congregation sang Amazing Grace, and Hans joined in, humming the tune in German, the words unfamiliar but the melody universal. A few ranchers glanced back, some with frowns, others with curiosity, but no one objected. After the service, Reverend Lyle shook their hands, his grip firm. "Come back anytime," he said. Hans nodded, unsure if he would but moved by the gesture. As weeks turned to months, the prisoners' reliability led to small but significant changes. Initially, a National Guard volunteer escorted them to and from the bunkhouse, a rifle slung over his shoulder. But the escorts were older men or teenagers, stretched thin by other duties, and supervising prisoners who showed no inclination to escape seemed like a waste of time. By late summer 1944, the escorts stopped and the prisoners walked the half-mile from the bunkhouse to the ranch unaccompanied, working under Tom's supervision and returning at day's end. The system depended on trust, and the prisoners didn't betray it. "Where would we go?" Klaus said one evening, sitting in the bunkhouse. "Run off into the plains? We'd starve or freeze before we got anywhere. Besides, they feed us better than the camp did." The trust grew in other ways. Tom taught Hans to ride a horse, a skill Hans had never imagined needing. His first attempt was shaky, the horse sensing his uncertainty. But Tom was patient, showing him how to sit, how to guide the animal with gentle pressure. "You'll get it," Tom said, a rare half-smile breaking through. When Hans finally managed to ride across the corral without falling, Tom nodded. "Good enough." Ellie began inviting the prisoners to the porch for evening meals on Sundays. Not a full dinner, but hearty stew or cornbread with beans, served in tin plates. The first time it happened, Hans hesitated, unsure if it was a trick. "Eat," Ellie said simply, pointing to the food. "Works hard, you need it." It wasn't kindness, not exactly, just the practical logic of people who understood that good work required good fuel, even for prisoners. The conversations were stilted at first, limited by language, but they grew easier as Hans's English improved. Tom would talk about the ranch, the cattle market, the weather, dry topics, but they grounded Hans in this new world. Ellie corrected his pronunciation with the same briskness she used to correct a poorly tied knot. Over time, Hans began to see the Dawsons not as captors, but as people with their own struggles, their own losses. Tom's nephew was still in Italy, his letters home full of censored gaps. Ellie's brother had died in the Pacific, a fact she mentioned once, without embellishment, when Hans asked about a photo on the mantle. Yet they didn't hold it against him, or if they did, they kept it buried, focusing instead on the work that needed doing. The trust was mutual. When a storm threatened the hay crop, Hans and the others worked late, stacking bales under tarps as thunder rolled in. They didn't have to, they could have stopped at the usual hour, but they understood what a lost crop meant for the ranch. When Tom sprained his ankle and couldn't ride, Hans took on extra duties, herding cattle with Mueller while Klaus repaired a broken gate. Tom watched from the porch, saying nothing but nodding approval when they returned. "You boys did all right," he said, and Hans felt a flicker of pride, not for himself but for the work, for the ranch that had become, in some small way, his responsibility too. By autumn 1944, the prisoners were no longer just labor, they were part of the Bar T's rhythm. Hans could saddle a horse without thinking, could spot a sick cow by its gait, could mend a fence with the same efficiency as Tom. The Dawsons noticed. One evening, as they sat on the porch eating cornbread, Tom handed Hans a small knife, its handle worn but sturdy. "For the fences," he said. "Easier than using those rusty pliers." It was a small gesture, but to Hans it felt like a handshake, a recognition that he was more than a prisoner, that his work had earned him a place, however temporary, in this world. The deepening trust at the Bar T Ranch wasn't built on grand gestures, but on the slow accumulation of small moments. Hans Weber, Klaus, and Mueller had become reliable fixtures, their work as much a part of the ranch's daily rhythm as the rising sun or the lowing cattle. By October 1944, Hans could anticipate Tom Dawson's instructions before they were given, knowing when to check the water troughs, when to rotate the herd to new pasture, or when to reinforce a sagging fence line before it collapsed. The work was second nature now, and with it came a sense of purpose Hans hadn't felt since his days as a mechanic in a small Bavarian town before the war. Back then, he'd fix tractors and farm equipment, his hands steady with tools. Here, on the Wyoming plains, those skills found new life, and Tom noticed. When a hay baler jammed, Hans spent an afternoon dismantling it, cleaning the gears and reassembling it with a precision that made Tom grunt in approval. "Could have used you years ago," he said, clapping Hans on the shoulder. A rare physical gesture that carried more weight than words. Ellie Dawson's contributions were quieter, but no less significant. She kept the prisoners fed, not just with coffee and biscuits, but with meals that grew heartier as the months passed. By winter, she was serving them stew thick with beef and potatoes, or cornbread with molasses, always with the same practical explanation: cold weather, hard work, you need fuel. But Hans noticed the care in her portions, the way she'd slip an extra slice of bread onto his plate when she thought he wasn't looking. It wasn't affection, not exactly, but a kind of respect, an acknowledgement that their work mattered to the ranch's survival. Once, when Mueller caught a cold, Ellie brought him a jar of honey and a thermos of hot tea, instructing him to drink it slowly. "Can't have you slowing down the others," she said, but her eyes softened for a moment, betraying a concern that went beyond utility. The language barrier, once a wall, became a bridge. Hans's English improved steadily, pieced together from Tom's instructions, Ellie's corrections, and snippets of conversation overheard at the general store. He could now follow Tom's explanations of cattle breeds or Ellie's stories about the ranch's history, tales of blizzards and droughts that shaped the land. In return, Hans taught Tom a few German phrases: Gute Arbeit for good work, Bitte for please, though Tom's accent made Klaus laugh behind his hand. The exchanges were practical, born of necessity, but they humanized both sides. Hans began to see Tom not as a captor but as a man who loved his land, who worried about his nephew in Italy, who carried the weight of keeping the ranch afloat in a world at war. Tom in turn saw Hans as a worker, not a faceless enemy, a man whose skill with a wrench or a rope made the Bar T stronger. The community's acceptance grew alongside this trust, though it was never universal. In Cheyenne, some locals remained cold. At the feed store, Mr. Callahan, whose brother had been killed in North Africa, would serve Tom but ignore the prisoners, his silence louder than any insult. Others softened over time. Miss Thompson at the general store started greeting Hans by name, asking about the ranch in a way that included him in the conversation. "Heard you boys fix that baler," she said one day, ringing up a sack of nails. "Tom's lucky to have you." Hans nodded, unsure how to respond to praise from a stranger, but the words stayed with him, a reminder that he was seen as more than a prisoner here. The local 4-H club, led by a wiry rancher named Ed Larson, even invited the prisoners to help with a community hay drive, a wartime effort to stockpile feed for struggling ranches. Hans and Klaus worked alongside teenagers and older men, stacking bales under a blazing sun. And though few words were exchanged, the shared sweat felt like a kind of acceptance. The church remained a space of uneasy unity. Reverend Lyle's invitation to Sunday services held firm, and Hans attended more regularly, drawn by the music and the quiet dignity of the small congregation. He'd sit in the back, singing hymns in German while the locals sang in English, their voices blending in a way that felt like a small miracle. One Sunday, a rancher's wife, Mrs. Cutler, approached Hans after the service, her expression hesitant but kind. "You sing well," she said. "Reminds me of my grandfather. He was German, came over in the 1880s. Hans nodded, surprised, and murmured a thank you. It was a fleeting moment, but it lingered. A reminder that this land, so foreign to him, was built on layers of immigration, of people who'd crossed oceans and found new homes. By spring 1945, with Germany's defeat imminent, the restrictions on the prisoners loosened further. The National Guard escorts had long since stopped, and the prisoners were trusted to move freely between the bunkhouse and the ranch, even to town on rare occasions when Tom needed an extra hand at the store. The system worked because the prisoners had no reason to run. As Muller put it one evening, whittling a piece of wood by the bunkhouse stove. "Escape to what? The mountains? To starve? We've got food, a roof, work that makes sense. Back home, it's all rubble now." Hans nodded, thinking of the letters from his sister in Dresden, describing a city reduced to ash, his parents' house gone, his family scraping by in a refugee camp. The bar T, with its steady routines and fair treatment, was a kind of refuge. However strange it felt to admit, the Dawsons began to treat the prisoners less like laborers and more like hired hands. Tom entrusted Hans with driving the ranch's old Ford tractor, teaching him to plow fields for the small patch of corn they grew to supplement feed. Hans took to it naturally, his mechanic's instincts kicking in, and when the tractor's engine sputtered, he fixed it without being asked, earning a rare grin from Tom. "You're wasted on soldiering," Tom said, wiping grease from his hands. "Should have been a rancher." Klaus, who'd been a baker before the war, started helping Ellie in the kitchen on Sundays, kneading dough for cornbread or biscuits. The first time he presented a tray of golden rolls, Ellie raised an eyebrow, tasted one, and nodded. "Not bad," she said, and Klaus beamed, a pride he hadn't felt in years. These small acts of trust built a bond that went beyond obligation. When a calf got stuck in a creek bed, Hans waded in without hesitation, his boots sinking into the mud as he helped Tom free the animal. When a late snow threatened the herd, the prisoners worked through the night, herding cattle to shelter, their breath steaming in the cold. They didn't do it for praise, but because the ranch's success had become their own in some small way. The Dawsons reciprocated. One evening, Ellie handed Hans a pair of gloves, worn but sturdy, to replace his tattered ones. "Winter's coming," she said. "Can't have you losing fingers." Hans accepted them, his throat tight, not because of the gloves, but because of what they meant. Care, however practical, for a man who'd once been their enemy. Conversations grew deeper as the war wound down. One evening in May 1945, after Germany's surrender, Tom and Hans sat on the porch, the sky streaked with red. Tom lit a cigarette, offered one to Hans, who declined. "Why'd you fight for him?" Tom asked, his voice low, not accusing. "Hitler, I mean. Man was a lunatic." Hans stared at the horizon, choosing his words carefully. "We were told Germany was wronged, that we were protecting our people, making us strong. Lies, mostly. You believe what you're taught, especially when you're young. By the time you see the truth, it's too late." Tom nodded, exhaling smoke. "My nephew wrote last week. Says Germany's a mess, people starving, cities gone. Makes you wonder why anyone follows a man like that." Hans hesitated, then said, "Your nephew, he's okay?" Tom's face softened. "Yeah. Coming home soon, engineer, building bridges now, instead of blowing them up." They sat in silence, the weight of the war between them, but no longer a barrier. Ellie joined them, bringing coffee, and the conversation shifted to the ranch, to plans for the next season. Hans ventured a question about her brother, the one lost in the Pacific. Ellie's face tightened, but she answered, "He was a pilot, shot down over Guadalcanal, never found him." She paused, then added, "Your family, Hans? You hear from them?" Hans nodded, his voice low. "Sister in Dresden, parents gone, she's with cousins now, trying to rebuild." Ellie's eyes met his, a flicker of understanding passing between them. "War's a strange thing," she said. "Takes so much, but here we are. You helping us helping you. Doesn't fix anything, but it's something." Hans nodded, the words settling into him like truth. When repatriation began in 1946, the prisoners faced a choice. Germany was a wasteland, cities destroyed, families displaced, the economy in ruins. The U.S. offered some prisoners the chance to stay as civilian workers, earning wages while Germany stabilized. Tom made Hans an offer one morning as they repaired a corral. "You're a good hand," he said. "Stay on if you want. Proper pay. A room in the cottage, not the bunkhouse. You know the work." Hans considered it, his mind torn. His sister needed him, but Germany offered nothing but hardship. Here he had stability, respect, a place where his work mattered. He accepted, and the transition was seamless. He moved to a small room in a cottage near the main house, received wages he could send home, and worked alongside Tom as an employee, not a prisoner. The change was marked by small things: a paycheck, the freedom to walk to town alone, the right to call the Dawsons by their first names. But they carried the weight of a new life. Klaus chose to return to Germany, hoping to find his fiancée in Cologne. Müller stayed, taking a job on a neighboring ranch. The farewells were quiet but heavy. Hans shook Klaus's hand at the train station, Ellie handing him a sack of biscuits for the journey. "Right when you get there," she said, her voice steady but her eyes betraying emotion. Klaus nodded, unable to speak, and boarded the train. Hans watched it pull away, wondering if he'd made the right choice to stay. But the bar T felt like a home now, however unlikely that seemed. The bonds endured. Hans worked at the bar T for 2 more years, saving money, sending it to his sister, who used it to rebuild a small house in Dresden. He wrote to the Dawsons after he returned to Germany in 1948, letters full of updates about his family, his new job as a mechanic, his sister's marriage. The Dawsons replied with news of the ranch, the cattle market, Tom's bad knee. In 1955, when Hans married, he sent a photo to the Dawsons, receiving a telegram in return. "Best wishes, Hans and bride. Dawson family. Bar T." He framed it, keeping it on his desk as a reminder of a time when enemies became something more. Müller stayed in Wyoming, marrying a local teacher and settling in Cheyenne. He and Hans met occasionally, sharing beers and memories of the ranch, their German accents softening with time. When Tom died in 1968, Hans made the long journey back for the funeral, standing in the same church where he'd once sung hymns as a prisoner. Ellie gripped his hand afterward, her voice steady despite her grief. "Tom always said you were the best hand he ever had. Thank you for coming." Hans nodded, his own eyes damp, and returned to Germany with a sense of closure, a chapter of his life complete. The American way, as Hans saw it, was defined by this experience, not by propaganda or ideals, but by actions. The Dawsons and their community didn't forgive or forget the war, but they chose practicality over hatred, treating prisoners as workers whose contributions mattered. It was a strength rooted in fairness, in trusting people to rise to the occasion when given a chance. For Hans, the lesson was profound. "The Americans beat us in battle," he wrote in a memoir years later, "but they taught me something deeper on that ranch. They showed me that humanity doesn't end with a uniform, that respect can rebuild what war destroys. I learned more about life from Tom and Ellie Dawson than I ever did from the Reich's promises."